Since before the era came to a close, there has always been a fascination with the Wild West. Whether it's gold, guns, or glory, the West offers audiences across the country and even around the world the promise of adventure. It was an untamed landscape in which the potential for prosperity seemed as real and likely as the dangers of defeat. It offered the world of film a canvas that told black and white morality tales just as much as it did the story of questionable anti-heroes. And so, it's no surprise that people seek to immerse themselves in such a world. At first, it was with shared stories and childhood games, and then with film and television. Today, video games. People have pretended to be a part of the Wild West so much that we eventually even got stories about other people pretending to be a part of the Wild West. So it's no surprise that when it comes to the immersive realm of theme parks, some try to find prosperity by tapping into the world's love of the Western. But just like the very Westerns they pay homage to, those parks can face defeat just as quickly as they can find success. This is the tale of one such park in Central Florida. This is the Ballad of Six Gun Territory. Ronald Braxton Coburn was, if nothing else, a driven businessman. Born in 1920 in South Carolina, he got his start as a grocery clerk in West Virginia before moving into independent grocery wholesaling. The business afforded him the ability to dabble in other trades, which included the taxi business, furniture manufacturing, clothing manufacturing, motel management, and home construction. It's important to find your passion. Those endeavors made R.B. Coburn a millionaire, and as a millionaire, he did what anyone else would do. He purchased a mountain. As the story goes, Coburn was a fan of ghost towns. They were abandoned remnants of communities, and in the West they were usually small mining towns that dried up along with their mine. Without demolition or redevelopment, they stood as snapshots, offering visitors a look back in time. Coburn had supposedly explored a number of these ghost towns over the years, and was inspired to build one of his own as a means of entertaining and educating the public about the Old West. Buck Mountain was located on the west end of Maggie Valley in North Carolina, which itself was about a 40-minute drive from Asheville. Coburn formed an amusement company called Western Heritage, purchased the mountain, renamed it to Ghost Mountain, which is definitely a cooler name, and flattened the top in order to build his very own Western ghost town. Except Coburn's ghost town was going to be very much alive. To build his non-ghost town, Coburn recruited a man by the name of Russell Pearson. Pearson, at the time, had made a name for himself when it came to designing Western-themed amusements. He had started off in Hollywood as a set designer before eventually being hired to work on exhibits for fairs. He also worked on projects such as Frontier City in Oklahoma. The amusement he was hired to build, called Ghost Town in the Sky, opened in the summer of 1961 and featured a number of Western-themed buildings that actors would occupy and bring to life. It turned out to be a fun little roadside attraction and did pretty well for itself during the first year. But for all of the charm and success that Ghost Town brought, it was still a fairly small amusement on top of a mountain in a region that wasn't particularly known for tourism. It was a good start, but what if it could be done better? What if the concept behind Ghost Town could be recreated on a larger scale? Somewhere where land was cheap and easy to develop, where it was nice and warm all year round, where tourists were already known to visit. Somewhere like Florida. In Florida, Coburn and Pearson would have something special that they never enjoyed at Ghost Mountain: the blessing of size. There was enough land there to hold all of the ideas and plans that they could possibly imagine. Coburn studied a map of Florida and noted that all of the major roads and highways eventually crossed paths in one area in particular. As he later put it, quote, "All roads lead straight to Ocala." Coburn started to plan for a new amusement on the east side of Ocala by Silver Springs. However, getting the land was trickier than expected. For a short time, it looked like he might have had to abandon his ideal location and instead settle for the second best area to build, Orlando. The land there was apparently cheap and plentiful and just waiting to be bought up. An Ocala landowner by the name of Eric Wagner saved the day though, and offered to lease Coburn much of the 228 acres in Ocala that he was looking to buy. It was situated right off of State Road 40, which would see plenty of traffic from tourists headed to Silver Springs. With that much land, Coburn and Pearson would be able to build a western town that was not only over 3 times the size of Ghost Town, but would also be able to sit comfortably in the middle of plenty of undeveloped forest. It would create a buffer that would separate their park from the outside world, and ensure that the sense of immersion wasn't ruined by, say, tacky motels or shops. On June 18, 1962, land clearing work began on the park, and plans were made to start construction on the town that September, with hopes of opening the following summer. Pearson decided to design the entire park using nothing but scale models, which were built by his wife Elizabeth. Years later, when questioned about the lack of formal blueprints for the park, he replied, quote, "Who needs them? They didn't have them when they built the old towns out west." A new location and a new scope called for a new name, and so Coburn's next amusement would be called Six Gun Territory. The residents of Ocala were thrilled. The opening of an amusement like Six Gun would only help put the city on the map for tourism. The project was estimated to cost $1.25 million, and a decent amount of that would go towards local companies hired to help build the park. The amusement was also expected to employ between 200 and 300 people, with over 80% of them coming from the local area. Construction progressed swiftly at Six Gun Territory. As it turned out, building an amusement that offered no rides made for an easier time in putting the park together. So over the following months, that late summer opening of 1963 turned into an early summer opening, and before long that too was pushed up to the beginning of February. In any other region, the change in seasons might have been an issue, but that wasn't the case in Florida. Just weeks prior to the opening, in a move that reflected both Coburn and Ocala's confidence in the park, Western Heritage purchased an additional 3.5-acre parcel of land next to Six Gun to square off their property. It was sold for $40,000, a record for the city at the time. It was worth it to Coburn because Six Gun Territory was going to be an experience to remember. Guests arriving would park in the main lot, designed to hold up to 4,000 cars, and purchase their admission at a Western-themed train station. They would board one of the 2 trains, both recreations of an 1860-era locomotive, where they would set off on a winding 2.5-mile ride through the property. Pearson wanted to use a mountain to help hide the town from guests first arriving, but for all that Florida had to offer, mountains weren't one of them. So Western Heritage built their own. Constructed out of a timber frame, wire mesh, and rubber-based paint, it stood 60 feet high at its tallest point and ran 250 feet long. Along the train ride, guests would see Native American camps, wagon train circles, cabins, and other reminders of the Old West. And on occasion, the train might be stopped midway to be held up by a gang of bandits or Native Americans. It was a small taste of the theatrics in store. Eventually, though, the train would arrive at a station, and guests would step off to be welcomed to Six Gun Territory. The 39-acre town consisted of 45 buildings across 8 square blocks, and every one of those buildings were real and could be explored by guests. Some of the highlights included the Frontier Hotel, where VIPs could actually spend the night. The Palace Saloon and Theater, which, like the Red Dog Saloon, offered drinks, live piano music, and dancing can-can girls. The drinks were made to look and sound like they'd fit in at an Old West saloon, with the main 3 options being Panther Sweat, Canyon Rum, and Red Eye. In reality, they were cola, root beer, and ginger ale, respectively. A 2-story courthouse that not only offered mock trials, but was home to the park's administrative offices, as well as the town's bathrooms. The Frontier Gazette, where for 50 cents guests could have newspaper pages printed out with their name in the headlines. The Territory Church, which when completed was handed over to the Marion County Ministerial Association, so that they could hold actual non-denominational service every Sunday afternoon that guests could attend. The Wells Fargo Stagecoach Office, which served as a real functional post office. The U.S. Post Office Department approved the park's application, allowing the location to sell stamps and process outgoing mail. On a daily basis, a postal worker riding a horse via Pony Express would collect the mail and actually ride it over to the Silver Springs post office. a firearms museum that displayed real guns from the era, many of which were on loan from the Ocala Police Department. An undertaker's office called Boot Hill and Diggers, which sold boots that were, according to the story, worn by others who ended up requiring the undertaker's services. And of course, the town had more shops than a guest could imagine. There was a general store, a ceramic shop, citrus shop, Miss Kitty's ice cream parlor, hat shop, barber shop, R.M. Walker's sandwich shop, George McKay's candy shop, and in classic Florida fashion, the Six Gun shop, which sold real guns. Towards the back of the town were also recreations of both a Native American village as well as a Mexican village. The Mexican village featured a cantina, adobe huts, and performances by dancers. The Native American village featured performances by 18 dancers from 8 different tribes in Oklahoma. While the town was one half of the equation, the other half were the citizens of Six Gun, made up of actors, musicians, and stuntmen who brought the town to life. Every hour on the hour, at one of 8 different locations, a shootout would occur. Sometimes it was a bar brawl turned duel, other times a bank robbery gone wrong. There was no stage, no stands, no posted showtimes. Guests exploring the town would just find themselves in the middle of a scene that would eventually escalate, often resulting in streets lined with visitors as the characters of Six Gun exchanged fire. The Undertaker would show up to drag off the encounter's loser, and life would continue on. The winners would go on to mingle and talk with guests. This was the appeal of Six Gun territory. It was an amusement park without rides. Its selling point was the opportunity to immerse yourself into what seemed like an authentic and realistic recreation of the Old West. It was an experience people jumped at after decades of watching the Wild West on both the silver and small screens, and Six Gun planned to use the stars of those screens to help with their grand opening. Western Heritage set February 2nd, 1963 as their grand opening for Six Gun territory, and they planned to stretch out the fanfare by featuring special guests over a matter of weeks. They kicked it off with Clint Walker, star of the ABC Western television show Cheyenne. The show had run from 1955 to 1962, so it was still plenty fresh in the minds of Americans visiting. Other special guests included Clu Gulager, who played Billy the Kid in the NBC series The Tall Man, John Bromfield, who played Sheriff Frank Morgan in the series Sheriff of Cochise, and perhaps most notable, Dan Blocker, who had played Hoss Cartwright in the 14-season NBC Western series Bonanza. The opening day saw a guest turnout of 7,500 people, and the following day brought in 4,000 guests. The Sunday crowd was ultimately lighter due to rain and cold weather. As it turned out, opening in February did make a bit of a difference. The figuratively lukewarm and literally cold opening was a slight disappointment to Coburn, who had initially hoped for a weekend crowd of 20,000, but it seemed like the result of elements outside of his control. The park itself was fairly well received, and press coverage of the amusement was flattering. One aspect of the experience that was welcomed by guests was the flat-rate entry pricing. A $2 ticket for adults and a $1 ticket for kids allowed guests to experience everything Six Gun had to offer. Of course, merch and food still carried their own price, but at a time where most amusements were packed with rides, and almost all of them utilized ticket book systems, it was refreshing to pay one price up front and not have to worry about taking out your wallet again to experience the entertainment that was on tap. Over the following few years, the park slowly grew in popularity. It enjoyed a bit of exclusivity when it came to themed attractions in Central Florida. Most of its competition were natural parks and springs, or the beaches a couple of hours away. Nothing else was really offering the unique experience that Six Gun was putting out there. However, Coburn felt that it could be doing better, and he figured that part of the reason it wasn't was that they did too good of a job hiding the park. After all, from the road, Six Gun territory was nothing but a sign and a small train station. The real spectacle was tucked away in the forest. So he tried to rectify that, and he did so with a gondola. In March of 1964, construction began on a $200,000 Skyway gondola system that would connect the front train station to the town. The transportation system was intentionally taller than it needed to be, reaching a height of 164 feet. The idea behind it was that from the road, The gondola system would be impossible to miss, and the structure would draw in visitors who were curious. On the flip side of that, the system itself would act as an attraction, offering a view of the Silver Springs area, not to mention the western town, that they couldn't get anywhere else. It was unfortunately a major compromise on the integrity of the park's theme, but it was one that would hopefully improve the park's fortunes overall. It was well timed too, because about a year and a half later, just 60 miles southeast of Six Gun territory, Florida Governor Hayden Burns was sitting down with entertainment giant Walt Disney and a room full of press to announce that Disneyland was coming to Florida. For that first year, most assumed that Florida would be getting their own East Coast Disneyland. It was an exciting prospect. Disneyland, just a decade old over in California, was a runaway hit. The assumption was that by building one in Florida, tourists would flock to the region, and that rising tide of tourism would lift all boats floating around Walt's playground. In February of 1967, just weeks after Walt had died from cancer, the press were offered a look at the last project he had appeared in, a short film that pitched to the public and potential sponsors what Disney World was going to be. As most suspected, part of it included a larger take on his Disneyland park, called Magic Kingdom. However, the real star of the show was Epcot, a functional, real city of the future. The project also called for an industrial park, as well as its own airport. Obviously, Disney World was larger than folks initially suspected. But to owners of amusements and parks in the area, the same ideas still held up. Disney World coming to Florida was only going to help their business. That optimism for the future not only drove amusement companies to invest in the region, but it also drove non-amusement-based companies to get into the amusement industry. On November 24, 1969, a company called Beaver Creek Industries purchased Western Heritage for $7.5 million in order to capitalize on the upcoming tourism boom. Prior to the acquisition, Beaver Creek was known for mobile home and snowmobile manufacturing. Through the purchase, Coburn was named head of their outdoor amusement division, and outwardly to the public, Six Gun assured everyone that the day-to-day operation of the park wouldn't change. Of course, that wasn't true. Within a year, perhaps in an attempt to increase attendance, or even prepare for the competition coming to the region, the park began work on an expansion to the town called Funland. Funland would offer guests 15 carnival rides, a petting zoo, and picnic facilities. None of it was particularly Western themed, nor were any of the rides that memorable. Its main selling point was that the park still utilized a flat-rate admission fee, meaning guests could ride any of the rides as much as they liked all day long. In April of 1970, just a month before Funland opened to the public, Beaver Creek sold Six Gun territory as well as the other two parks they had acquired with Western Heritage. They had run into a litany of financial problems that were no doubt partially caused by investing in an industry they knew nothing about. The buyers, a company called National Service Industries Incorporated, were doing exactly the same thing Beaver Creek tried to do. Up until that point, they had specialized in linen manufacturing as well as cleaning chemicals, so naturally they were perfectly equipped to run a theme park like Six Gun. October 1st, 1971 rolled around, etching a distinct line in Florida's history. One that would separate a Florida without Walt Disney World and one with Walt Disney World. It was time to see if everything business owners had spent years hoping would happen with Disney's arrival actually happened. As it turned out, it did. Just months later, in January of 1972, Six Gun Territory reported that attendance was up over the same period the last year, crediting the general rise in tourism that Disney World brought to the region. Visitors were driving down to Central Florida to spend a day or two at Disney World, and that meant finding something else to do during the rest of their vacation. National Service Industries Incorporated tried to keep things fresh at Six Gun by rotating in new rides on a regular basis. At that point, they owned a handful of amusement parks, and so whenever they purchased a new ride, the lineup would be shuffled around at all the parks to keep things changing. Six Gun did see their numbers drop in 1973 during the US oil crisis, but that was no different than any other amusement in the state at the time. It was outside of their control. Unfortunately for them, two major developments of the 1970s followed that would also prove to be outside of their control, and would ultimately spell trouble for Six Gun territory. While many business owners expected the addition of Walt Disney World to be a boon to their endeavors, what many of them didn't expect was the legions of new business owners who would follow in Disney's footsteps in order to cut out a piece of the pie for themselves. Overnight, new hotels, restaurants, and shops were opening to cater to the rise in tourism in the area. But at the same time, new amusements were opening with hopes of winning some of those tourists' extra days. Parks like Circus World and SeaWorld opened to the public and were a stone's throw away from Disney compared to the hour-and-a-half drive to Silver Springs. Disney was Disney. There would never be any doubt that they'd maintain the lead in Florida amusements. Every park that opened was vying for a piece of the leftovers, and as each one did, those leftovers got smaller and smaller. This was especially a problem for Six Gun, whose rides were cookie-cutter and forgettable. The real selling point for the park was the Western town, and perhaps that would be enough to survive, if not for the fact that Westerns were quickly falling out of style. The Western genre itself dates all the way back to the early days of cinema. Depictions of the Wild West were reflections of America's identity as a nation. Right after World War II, Western films gave audiences black and white morality tales set in a frontier that represented everyone's fascination with the unknown. Even as the moral compass of viewers grew more complex, so too did the protagonists of Westerns. But as the stories and characters in the genre evolved, the setting always captured the potential and promise that a new frontier offered. Then, in the late 1950s and 1960s, Americans were slowly introduced to a new frontier. The space race of the Cold War shifted the mindset of American audiences and fueled an interest in science fiction as a genre. By the 1970s, audiences were turning towards grittier films that were refreshing departures from the studio system that dominated Hollywood over the previous few decades. Westerns as a genre didn't disappear completely, but it saw a significant decline in popularity as a result. For film, it was no big deal. Genres come and go many times over, and old fads eventually make comebacks. Studios ultimately just make different movies. But for a theme park that was exclusively themed after one of the genres that fell out of fashion, it was a problem. The combination of these two shifts put Six Gun territory on a slow path of decline. At its peak in 1972, the park saw over 400,000 guests. By 1977, that number had dropped to 260,000. Had the park been independently owned, and its owners entirely focused on the endeavor, it would have been the time for them to evolve, try new things, and overall do what it took to survive. The reality of the situation, though, was that Six Gun was playing third fiddle behind linens and cleaning chemicals. National Service Industries wasn't looking for a pet project. They were looking for an easy moneymaker. So on September 10, 1978, NSI decided to sell Six Gun territory, and they decided to do it by putting an ad out in the paper. Understandably, they struggled to find a buyer. As it turned out, people weren't rushing in to pay the asking price of $2.8 million for a failing theme park in an increasingly saturated market. So towards the start of November, the owners informed the 100-plus Six Gun employees that the park would not be opening that following weekend. They would continue to seek out a buyer for the park and decided that it was up to the discretion of the new owner as to whether or not it would reopen. As 1978 became 1979, NSI still couldn't find anyone. So they decided that if by February they couldn't find a buyer, that they'd auction everything off separately. Then, during the 11th hour, a group of 4 Virginian investors came to the rescue. The group chose to remain anonymous, only describing themselves as a lawyer, a contractor, a corporate executive, and an accountant. And their interest in the park was so late to the game that NSI kept their auction planned just in case the deal fell through. However, it didn't fall through, and in early February, for a discounted price of $1.6 million, Six Gun territory gained a second chance. Park management announced that Six Gun would be reopened on April 7th and would introduce a few changes. Small new activities such as face painting and arts and crafts like pottery making were added to the Native American village. They also brought back a musical revue show called Buttons and Bows, which presumably aimed to compete with Disney's Hoop-Dee-Doo musical revue. The most noticeable change, though, was to the pricing. Prior to the shutdown, the park cost $6.95 for adults and roughly half that for kids. After the reopening, tickets were reduced to $3.50 for adults and $3 for children. However, it only covered the activities at the western town. To experience the rides at Funland, guests had to pay an additional $2 for adults and $1.50 for kids. Lastly, rather than run all of the various shops themselves, the new owners began to lease out the western town shops to private separate owners. These changes were bizarre and fairly minor compared to the substantial challenges the park faced. Yet they allowed Six Gun Territory to hobble along for another 4 years. In 1982, Walt Disney World introduced Epcot Center, which not only added one more competing theme park into the mix, but a theme park from the undisputed leaders in the region. It meant that the second place spot that everyone else had been battling over for nearly a decade was now lost forever to Disney. They would instead have to compete for third place. They didn't know it at the time, but with Universal Studios and Disney MGM Studios on their way before the decade was out, even third and fourth place would eventually fall out of reach. This really put Six Gun Territory in a dire situation. Now, normally when this happens, the writing is usually on the wall long enough that the company in question has time to plan their closure and make a formal announcement. That wasn't the case with Six Gun, though. On Wednesday, January 25th, 1984, the city of Ocala cut the power to Six Gun Territory, citing an outstanding debt of $34,687. The park would never reopen. The owners would ultimately sell the amusement park to a company called Tri-Towers Incorporated for a price of $1.7 million. However, Tri-Towers had no interest in giving the park a third chance. They were interested in the nearly 200 acres of land in Central Florida. That year, they arranged for a 3-day-long auction at which everything was sold off. The major prize were the 2 locomotives and train track, which went to an anonymous buyer in Arizona for $225,000. With the land split up and sold off, the front-facing portions of Six Gun would be converted into a shopping center, which still exists today and pays homage to its predecessor with its name, Six Gun Plaza. Six Gun Territory was unique in more ways than one. The concept itself stood out from other amusements at the time, initially foregoing rides in order to more fully immerse guests into another era. But more importantly, the concept managed to fall into this one-of-a-kind position where it was both behind the curve and ahead of it at the same time. It was built too late, trying to bank on a historical era and film genre that was quickly falling out of style. What's worse is that by being a park that exclusively themed itself after that genre, its fate was left in the hands of pop culture trends. Had Western Heritage or their subsequent owners used some of those 200 extra acres to build different towns with different themes, it might have stood a better chance against the changing currents. Yet, at the same time, Six Gun Territory was a precursor to what we're starting to see grow in popularity today, which is this idea of fully immersing guests into a unified setting and story. Lands like Galaxy's Edge and amusements like Evermore Park in Utah are taking that Six Gun mentality to the next level by not only introducing guests to another world, but inviting them to be participants in it. The upcoming Galactic Star Cruiser at Disney World will offer guests a multi-day, fully immersive experience that tells an overall story. Even outside of the world of theme parks, shows like Sleep No More expand on what a theater production can be, all in the name of immersion. Who knows, had Six Gun Territory survived the changing face of Central Florida, it might have been able to serve as a leader in this space and perhaps even thrive. But we'll never know, because the reality is that, like many amusements at the time, Six Gun Territory did not survive the changes to the region. So instead, it's relegated to the history books. Just another set of memories, just another ghost town.
Meanwhile, in another part of Six Gun, 2 trail-hardened desperados have sneaked into the backside of town. They're bent on getting rid of the marshal. Our marshal is a reformed bad man himself, and he knows how to handle such situations. He's the famous Sundance Kid, About to begin another day at 6 gun.